Here's something I never thought I'd say. My dad's best friend told me a secret so shocking, I literally couldn't find the words to respond. It happened so fast, and yet, in that moment, time felt like it slowed down. You know that feeling when someone tells you something so unexpected that your brain just shuts off? That was me, standing there, staring, trying to process what I had just heard. It all started on an ordinary afternoon. I had known my dad's best friend, Mark, for as long as I could remember. He was always around, family barbecues, holidays, even just random weekends when my dad needed a hand fixing something in the garage. To me, he was like an uncle, someone I never really thought twice about. But looking back, I wonder if I missed the signs, if there were things he wanted to say but never did. That day, I was alone at home when he showed up. He looked different, like he had a lot on his mind. I figured he was just stopping by to see my dad, but then he asked if we could talk. I thought, talk? About what? There was something in his voice that made me uneasy, like he was carrying a weight he couldn't hold any longer. I wasn't sure what to expect, but nothing could have prepared me for what he was about to say. At first, he hesitated. He kept rubbing his hands together, his eyes shifting around the room like he was looking for an escape. And then he took a deep breath and said it. Just like that. The words left his mouth, hanging in the air between us, and I felt my stomach drop. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. My mind was racing, my heart pounding. Did I hear that right? Was he serious? I couldn't look at him. I wanted to say something, anything, but my thoughts were all over the place. What was I supposed to do? Pretend I didn't hear it? Laugh it off? Confront him? There were so many emotions hitting me at once. I felt frozen. And the worst part? He was waiting, waiting for me to react, to say something that would make this moment less unbearable. But I couldn't. I just stood there, trapped in the tension, feeling like the ground had been pulled from under me. That was the moment I realized. Whatever I said next could change everything. My relationship with him, my relationship with my dad, maybe even my entire family dynamic. One wrong move, and things would never be the same again. And that's when it hit me. There was no easy way out of this, no simple answer, no way to undo what had just been said. So, what did I do? How did I respond to a confession that turned my world upside down? Well, that's where things get even more complicated. I stood there, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Mark's eyes were locked on me, searching for some kind of reaction, but I still couldn't find the words. It felt like my brain was trying to catch up with what had just happened, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't process it fast enough. The room, which had felt normal just minutes ago, now felt smaller, heavier, like the air had thickened, making it hard to breathe. Mark shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. I know this is a lot, he said, his voice quieter now. I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. His tone wasn't casual. It wasn't something he just blurted out without thinking. No, this was something he had carried for a long time, and that made it even worse. I felt a strange mix of emotions, shock, confusion, and something I couldn't quite name. A part of me wanted to ask why now? Why, after all these years, did he suddenly feel the need to confess this to me? And what did he expect me to do with this information? But I couldn't bring myself to ask. I was afraid of the answer. My mind kept flashing back to all the times Mark had been around, the family dinners, the long talks he'd had with my dad over coffee, the way he'd always been so involved in our lives. Was there something I had missed? Some moment that should have tipped me off? I replayed memories in my head, looking for clues I had never thought to look for before. But nothing stood out. To me, he had always just been Mark, my dad's best friend, someone I trusted. Now that trust felt shaky, like I was standing on a bridge that could collapse at any second. I didn't want to assume the worst, but the way he was looking at me, like he was waiting for something, made my stomach twist. Was he hoping I'd understand? That I'd say something to make it okay? I finally forced myself to speak, my voice quieter than I expected. I I don't know what to say. It was the truth, the only truth I had in that moment. Mark sighed and nodded as if he had expected that response. I get it, he said, his eyes dropping to the floor. I just, I had to tell you. I didn't know what scared me more, the confession itself or the fact that deep down, I knew this conversation wasn't over. Whatever came. Next, I wasn't ready for it. I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. Mark just stood there, watching me, like he was waiting for some kind of reaction that I wasn't ready to give. My chest felt tight, my hands clammy. I wanted to rewind time, go back to a few minutes ago when everything still felt normal. But I couldn't. The words were out there now, and there was no taking them back. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Did my dad know? Had he ever suspected anything? If he did, would it change how he saw Mark? And what about me? I still didn't even know how I felt about what had just been said. I wanted to believe that things could go back to how they were, that I could pretend this conversation never happened. But deep down, I knew that was impossible. Mark shifted, breaking the silence. I know this is a lot, he said again, his voice softer this time. I don't expect you to say anything right now. I needed to be honest. His words lingered in the air, making my skin prickle. Honest. That word felt so heavy in this moment. I swallowed hard, my mind flashing back to all the times Mark had been there. Every holiday, every birthday, every late night conversation he'd had with my dad. Was there always something more beneath the surface? Had I been blind to something that had been right in front of me all along? Then another thought hit me. What if someone else found out? If my dad knew, if my mom knew, this wouldn't just be my problem anymore. It could tear everything apart. The idea made my stomach twist. I looked at Mark, searching for some kind of answer in his expression, but all I saw was uncertainty. He was just as lost in this as I was, and that scared me more than anything, because if he didn't know where this was going, how was I supposed to? The silence between us felt heavier with every passing second. Mark had said what he needed to say, but now it was on me to respond, to decide what happened next. But how was I supposed to do that when I didn't even know what I was feeling? My thoughts were tangled, a mess of confusion, fear, and something else I couldn't name. Mark took a deep breath, his fingers tapping anxiously against his leg. I don't want this to change things, he said carefully, as if he knew the damage had already been done. I just thought you deserved to know. Deserved to know what? That was the part I couldn't wrap my head around. Why now? Why tell me this after all these years? What was I supposed to do with this information? It felt like he had dropped a bomb in my lap and expected me to just carry it. But I didn't want to. I wanted to push it away, pretend I had never heard it. But it was too late for that. I glanced toward the door, suddenly hyper-aware of how alone we were. If my dad walked in right now, if anyone overheard this conversation, everything would spiral out of control. The thought made my pulse race. Does anyone else know? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark hesitated, and for a second, I saw something flicker in his expression. Guilt? Regret? I wasn't sure, but then he shook his head. Number just you. That didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made it worse. Now I had to carry this secret, and I didn't know if I was strong enough for that. I could feel my heart pounding, my breath uneven. There was no undoing this moment, no pretending it didn't happen. The walls felt like they were closing in, the weight of the secret pressing harder against my chest. I had to say something, anything, to break the tension before it swallowed me whole. But before I could, Mark took a step closer. His voice was low, steady. Just, promise me you won't say anything. Not yet. And that's when I realized I wasn't just caught in the middle of this. I was part of it now, whether I wanted to be or not. I stared at Mark, his words echoing in my head. Just promise me you won't say anything. Not yet. He was asking me to keep this secret, to carry this weight alone. My mouth felt dry. I wanted to say no, to tell him I couldn't do that, but I hesitated. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, desperate, almost pleading. Or maybe it was because I still didn't know what the right thing to do was. Before I could answer, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made both of us freeze. My stomach dropped. My dad was home. Mark's entire body tensed, and for the first time, I saw something close to panic in his eyes. You won't say anything, right? He whispered, stepping back like he was already preparing to act normal. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The front door opened, and my dad's familiar voice filled the room. Hey, what's going on? He glanced between us, his eyebrows pulling together like he sensed something was off. Mark cleared his throat, forcing a smile. Just stopped by to see you, man. I felt sick. Just a few minutes ago, Mark had been looking at me like I held his entire world in my hands. And now, he was acting like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just turned my life upside down. My dad clapped him on the shoulder, completely unaware of the tension still thick in the air. Good timing. I was just about to fire up the grill. You staying for dinner? Mark hesitated for a second before nodding. Yeah, sure. I couldn't believe it. He was really going to sit at our table, eat with my dad like everything was normal. Like he hadn't just told me something that changed everything. I swallowed hard, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. If I had any doubt before, it was gone now. Mark wasn't just asking me to keep a secret. He was asking me to live with it, to pretend, to lie. And then, as I stood there, watching them laugh like nothing was wrong, another thought hit me. What if Mark wasn't the only one keeping secrets? What if there was something else, something even bigger, that I still didn't know? Dinner felt like a slow-motion nightmare. Mark sat across from me, laughing at my dad's jokes, acting like nothing had happened. I barely touched my food, my mind racing. My dad had no idea. He was sitting there, completely unaware of the storm brewing right in front of him. I kept replaying Mark's words in my head, the way he had looked at me, the way he had begged me to stay silent. But I wasn't sure I could anymore. Then, just as I was about to excuse myself, my dad put down his fork and let out a deep sigh. Mark, I need to tell you something, he said, his voice unusually serious. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. Mark looked up, confused. What is it? There was a pause, a heavy, loaded silence. My dad ran a hand through his hair, then finally spoke. I know. The air was sucked out of the room. My hands clenched under the table. Mark's face drained of color. What? His voice was barely above a whisper. My dad's eyes flicked to me for the briefest second before settling back on Mark. I've known for a while, he said. I just never thought you'd actually say it. My stomach twisted. He knew. I had been carrying this secret, struggling under its weight, and my dad had already known. I looked at Mark, whose face was frozen in shock. For the first time, he was speechless. Then my dad exhaled, shaking his head. Look, I don't want this to ruin everything, but you should have come to me, not. He stopped himself, glancing at me again. My breath caught. He knew. He had always known. Mark swallowed hard, his hands tightening around his napkin. I didn't know how, he admitted. And then my dad leaned forward, his voice firm. Well, you've said it now. So what happens next? The table went silent, and for the first time all night, Mark didn't have an answer. The silence stretched between us, thick and unmovable. I could feel my pulse in my ears, waiting for someone, anyone, to say something. Mark opened his mouth, then shut it again, like he was still trying to piece together what had just happened. My dad knew. He had always known. And somehow, I was the last one to find out. I let out a slow breath, trying to make sense of it all. I had spent the entire night feeling like I was carrying a secret that could shatter everything. But the truth was, the cracks had been there long before I even realized. My dad wasn't shocked. He wasn't angry. He was just tired, like he had been waiting for this moment, dreading it, but accepting it all the same. Mark finally cleared his throat. I never meant for it to happen like this, he said quietly. My dad nodded, staring at his plate for a long moment before finally looking up. Yeah, but it did. His voice wasn't filled with anger, just resignation. I swallowed, realizing that I didn't even know how I felt anymore. The tension, the fear, the weight of it all. It was still there, but it felt different now, lighter in a way, because the truth was out. No more guessing, no more pretending. Mark ran a hand down his face, exhaling. So, where do we go from here? My dad looked at him, then at me, before leaning back in his chair. That depends, he said simply. Can we move forward, or does everything change? The question hung in the air, unanswered, because the truth was, none of us really knew. The only thing that was clear was that things had changed, whether we liked it or not. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't the worst thing. As I sat there watching them both, I realized something. The hardest part wasn't hearing the truth. It was deciding what to do with it. And maybe, just maybe, the answer wasn't something that had to be figured out right away.